Hello and welcome to the Chicago Humanities Festival and today's program, Clarissa Ward on All Fronts. My name is Travis Whitlock. You can learn more about upcoming events at chicagohumanities.org and help support them by either donating or also becoming a member. Thanks to our captioner for making this event more accessible. All digital events have closed captioning, which can be controlled through YouTube. You can learn more about accessible services at chicagohumanities.org/access. This program is generously underwritten by Bill and Penny Obenshain. Thank you. This week's programs are also presented with the support of WTTW. Please help me and welcome Jane M. Sachs and Clarissa Ward.
Hello, Clarissa.
Hello, Jane.
So nice to see you. Not really in person, but I'm glad that we have met in person, so that this is just a mere second choice. But I want to start just by asking you how you're doing and how you and your family are doing.
Well, thank you very much. We're doing well. I had a baby 2.5 months ago, a little boy. So I now have two boys, a 2.5-year-old and a 2-month-old. And we are at home in London. It's late at night, but everyone is healthy and we're very blessed.
That's wonderful. Really, those are some great ages and a lot of velocity there, in quarantine.
Yes.
But I just want to, make sure you're holding on and you're holding in. And we were supposed to talk in April, and of course it got waylaid. But I'm really pleased that we're able to talk today.
Me
and
too.
I wanted to just start with, reading this book is a really rare experience for all of us. It's insights into a world that very few people have and understand. And clearly, it's also a rare experience for you. You are turning the microphone and the pen on yourself, which is not something that you usually do. And so I really wanted to ask you, just to begin with, how has that affected you and your work? Just the process of committing to doing a book like this and focusing back on yourself.
So I have been petrified about writing a book for as long as I can remember. People often ask me if I have nightmares about all the terrible things I've seen over the years. And I say, no, my recurring nightmare is that I'm back in college and I have a 25-page paper due the next day. And I haven't even started writing it, which is actually very true to what my collegiate experience was like. There's something about writing that is so profoundly solitary, and it provokes a lot of anxiety in me. And particularly when you're writing about yourself and your personal experience. On the one hand, of course, it flows because you're just speaking your truth and you're writing from a place of authenticity and you're capturing or recounting stories that you've experienced. But it's petrifying because you're putting yourself out there. You're showing the world you. And normally as a journalist, we don't really do that. Yes, we're in front of the camera and we're part of the tapestry of any story. But what I understood as I got further on my career is that so much of the way I see and understand the world and conflict and different cultures is shaped by moments that happen behind the camera, is shaped by human connections that I have forged over the years, by countless acts of kindness, small acts of kindness. They don't make it onto the evening news, but they do determine the way you understand or see a people or a place. And it increasingly became clear to me that precisely because I was so petrified of writing a book, and I was so petrified of putting myself out there, and I was so indebted to all of these people whose paths I've crossed, I needed to actually seize on the moment. And for me, the moment was being pregnant, knowing that my first son was going to be born, knowing that I wanted to have a record for him when he got older of who I am, other than being mom, and what I've seen and what I've experienced. And so, yes, petrifying, but ultimately really cathartic, and also hugely beneficial in terms of looking at yourself and looking at the body of work and looking at the experiences and having a much better lens to actually understand things that before you're just living through and going through and not necessarily reflecting on.
I mean, it's fascinating because, you're really talking about the connective tissue of life, not the monuments, right? And, you understand that in cities and in historical moments and even our own human evolution. And if anybody has any proximity to the growth of a child or a human being, that everyone thinks it's these monumental moments, but it's really like, how do you get there and how does it connect? One of the things you said to me the other day when we were able to talk for a bit was that, this started out as a letter to your son, and then it really became a love letter to journalism and journalists. So can you talk a little bit about this?
So yeah, I wanted my son, as I mentioned, to sort of have a better understanding of who I was. And so I started writing it as a letter to him. And I sent a few early chapters to my agent, Binky Urban, who read them and was like, there's a lot of cursing and a lot of violence. And I think people are going to struggle to understand how this is a letter to like your unborn baby son. So I was like, okay, that is a fair assessment. So we sort of reshaped it a little bit. But yes, as I was writing it, I realized that it's not really a letter to my son, though, of course, I very much hope he will read it one day and understand me better as a result. This is all about the craft. This is about the passion. This is about the acts of heroism, the acts of kindness, the cruelty, the laughter, the highs, the lows, the camaraderie. This is about having, I believe, the greatest job in the world, the privilege of witnessing history firsthand, but also the incredible cost of witnessing history firsthand. And as I was reading through an early draft, it suddenly occurred to me that, yes, this is a love letter to journalism. We live in this age now where people are banding around terms like fake news and everyone's criticizing mainstream media. And of course, that's depressing when you're on the front lines in Aleppo and getting shot at. It's demoralizing to hear that kind of rhetoric. But when I wrote all this down and I read it, and you see the amount of effort and love and frankly, blood, sweat, and tears that goes into doing this job, not just me, but all my countless colleagues who are doing similar work, that's what this job is about. It's a passion and it's a devotion, it's a vocation, it's a calling, and it requires a huge amount emotionally, physically, logistically, you name it. This is a demanding job. So yes, this is my sort of homage to journalism. And I really hope that people will read it, and whether or not they're super engaged with the geopolitics of what's going on in Syria, for example, I hope that they will connect to it on a human level and be left with, at the very least, respect for what we do, but more than that, real profound respect for the people who risk their lives to let us tell their stories.
No, I mean, that's stunning, because what you're articulating is having work in the world, not just a job. Every time you said job, I was like, work, because it is your work. And the book is really about you developing and honing your practice. And what does it mean for you, Clarissa, to do this work? How do you do it? How do you define it? Obviously, there are principles and structures and kind of rules of being a journalist. But then within that architecture, you have to define it for yourself. And we know people do it in lots of different ways. And so this book is so much about how you develop your practice and your work in the world. And I'm glad you have a job in that there's a station and a place that wants your voice and the work and the way you do it. But I would probably venture to say that you would do it no matter what and no matter where. One insight I had when I was reading the book, you don't only witness, you accompany, and those are very different things. And, you know, I was mentioning this as like just kind of an insight into the book, was that there's a point where you are really subject and object of yourself. You are in it and you are watching yourself being in it, and you are commentating on it, and you are deeply immersed. Then there's a shift in the book where you really become just subject. You are no longer watching yourself. You are 150% in the center of it. And I even say there's a line on page 228, and I want to say the page because it's that deep in the book, where someone asks you, you know, why are you here, Clarissa? And you admit that you're not really sure, and you answer, I don't know. So could you talk a little bit about kind of that tension between being subject and object, and how one starts to understand why you are there, Clarissa?
I mean, first of all, I just have to say, it gives me, it's so rewarding to hear you talk about the book in those terms, and thinking about it in those terms, and really forcing me to reflect on things that maybe weren't even conscious at the time of writing, but are so illuminating to read back and look over it. And there's no question that, yes, when I look at myself as a young journalist, I do look at myself with, there's a distance, right? There's a veil, there's a separation somehow. I know that person, I was that person, I relate to that person, but I wasn't who I am today. And I wasn't yet really a journalist. I was a seeker. I felt I had a calling. I was busy trying to educate myself, but it wasn't until the Syrian conflict that I think I really did start to understand on a more profound level why I was there, what my role was, and what the limitations of that role were. And because I think when you start out in this industry, or at least for me, I came of age in the 9/11 era. And so it was all about, I need to go out, fix the problem, solve the miscommunication, act as a translator between worlds, make everybody start communicating better, and in the process try to avert more horrendous acts of violence like this. Or when the Iraq War started, it's like, we need to end the war because this is, you know, not helping anyone, and the Iraqis are suffering, and the occupation is a disaster. Or and so on and so on. I always had these sort of quite lofty goals. In Syria, I was so humbled because I put my whole heart into covering that war. And I lost so many friends along the way. And I had to appreciate and take a step back and understand that at the end of the day, I wasn't able to alter the course of history. I wasn't able to mitigate the suffering of the Syrian people. I hope that I was able to shine a spotlight on their suffering and the tragedy and the inhumanity and the brutality, but I certainly couldn't do anything to stop it. And there was a lot of pain that came with that realization, and a sense that I was failing people, and profound guilt about going home and having a normal life. But then there was also, at a certain point, a moment of clarity or a revelation, a moment of humility, where I understood it's not my job. It's not my work even to solve this conflict or to dictate to others how it should be solved. My job is to shine a light on this. It is to tell these people's stories. It is to bear witness, even when it is incredibly painful, to keep looking at something. And it is to humanize complex stories for audiences far away, so that they become, hopefully, more immersed, more empathetic, and more well-informed. And once I understood my calling within a much more humble framework, I think that's the moment I came into my own as a journalist. I became the subject, and I felt that I had so much more autonomy. I knew where I wanted to drive the car now, which direction to move in. which was incredibly liberating, because up until that point, I think you're kind of, and this is normal for any young journalist, you're improvising, you're feeling your way through the dark. And you feel when you're hitting on something that resonates and you're like, okay, I'm on something here. This is profound. This is something I need to explore. But yes, the real sort of eureka moment for me came pretty late. I mean, we're talking like 5 years ago. So,
you know, I don't know about late in the arc of history, and you know, but I just think that, again, it goes back to a practice. And, you know, I always talk about this in kind of arts and culture, is this idea of honing your practice when no one is watching, when there are no papers due, when there isn't an exhibition, when no one's waiting to give you an award. You know, how do you make sense of what your practice is, and kind of what drives it, almost like velocity, like physics, you know, what pushes this thing and that thing. I think the more you become subject in your book, I think also you shine the light on the kind of reciprocal relationship you have with the reader of your book, with the viewers, you know, of your television, you know, program, of your written, you know, work. Like this idea that we need you to be subject of your work, and you also need us to be open to learning and shifting and evolving and reflecting, and to be subject of, you know, what does it mean about what's happening in Syria? What does that mean to me and my life, and how I locate myself in the world that I share with you? And so what happens as you become more and more comfortable being the subject, you kind of shine the light back on all of us, saying, okay, you know, we are all subjects of our lives. Where are you in this geometry? And you're not a bystander. I want to talk a little bit about your approach, and you started to talk about that a little bit, but you know, your work is not linear, and you don't start and say, you know, I'm going here to cover this, and I can see the 360 degrees, and which piece of it do I want to do? So let's talk a little bit about when you're searching for the story, or the story is searching for you. You know, how do you approach that process? How do you stay humble, but also focused and rigorous? And how do you get to places that most people can't?
It's such a good question. I mean, it's interesting you say, how do you get to places that other people can't? And that is a huge driving force for me. So I'm like, so you're saying no one's ever interviewed a Western jihadi in Syria? Okay, how do I crack the code? Not because I'm competitive, but because I'm naturally drawn to stories that are doable, but are really only possible after you build relationships with people from such a wildly diametrically opposed existence to you that it's almost unfathomable. So for me, I found working on stories around ISIS, extremism, and really digging deep into Salafi jihadism and what it meant. It involved learning a new language for me. But by learning that new language, and by spending hours and hours and weeks and months, honestly, on various social media apps, communicating with Western jihadis in Syria, and establishing not friendship, because that's certainly not what it is, but a level of mutual respect, whereby you could start to think about, okay, how could I come and interview you? How can this be done without me being at risk of, you know, being kidnapped or potentially even executed, and without you being at risk because they have their own ideas as well about Western journalists all being spies, and I'm going to, you know, call in a drone the minute I see you and you're going to be killed. And I've always been attracted to trying to crack that code, and to get to a place with someone, even if we quite clearly don't share the same values, where we are able to agree on certain basic guidelines and ethical standards that we'll both adhere to. It was the same thing that drove me last year to go and spend 3 days with the Taliban. which no Western journalist has done in a long time. But I was like, there must be a way to do it. And I had lunch with an Afghan filmmaker who's done a lot of work with the Taliban. He's an incredible filmmaker. And I said to him, Naj, I want you to take me and Selma, my female colleague, producer, now reporter. I want you to take us in to the Taliban with you. And he laughed. He was like, you're crazy. But by the end of lunch, he was like, okay, you may be crazy, but you are also serious. So let's think about how you can do this. How can we do this? It took months. It took actually longer to persuade CNN than it took to persuade the Taliban. But my point being, a lot of journalists these days don't have the bandwidth to invest months and months in projects that may hit a brick wall and may go nowhere. And I've had that happen before, where I'm this close to getting a great interview with a big get, and it just doesn't happen. And it's taken weeks and months of my time. So it really comes down to, even when you're looking at my broader sort of body of work, this obsession almost with finding a connection to someone. I don't care how different we are. I don't care how reprehensible I find you or how you find me. I know there's something we can connect on. I know there's something that we can see eye to eye on, or we can agree to. And I find that incredibly challenging, exciting, and fascinating, frankly. And I also am a firm believer in the power of listening to other people, regardless of how upsetting we might find what they have to say. That doesn't mean you give a gratuitous platform to hate speech or anything like that. But there are sensible adult conversations to be had, and listening has to be a cornerstone of any conversation that's going to be like that. And ultimately, that's essential to try to elevate public discourse. So I think when I look for stories, that's a big part of it.
You know, I think you have to bring up kind of the power and the value of difference, right? And what that means to just find a place you connect, but also acknowledge how you're different. So it's not, your job is not to persuade, right? But it's to say,
Yeah,
actually, I want to talk to someone that, you know, I don't understand. Even when you say learn a language, you know, a new language, I also hear you saying a new language metaphorically, right? And
yes,
physically and emotionally and spiritually. And what does this mean for you to be in this place? And I think that is why we need to go around the world in metaphorical and real ways, but also why, you know, we need you to. And it kind of brings me a little bit to kind of the evolving role of journalists. You know, the journalists have really become the target in a relatively short period of time. It's not recent, but in some ways it is. You know, that reporters are not seen as kind of neutral ambassadors, and that journalists, you know, are not seen as kind of off limits. You know, in the same way that kind of the lines of the front line has been blurred, the role of journalism has been blurred. It's also, you know, it's become more advocacy, more storytelling. You know, it's also become more inclusive and diverse. And so I just wondered if you could just talk a little bit about kind of how journalism is changing, and in the time, you know, even from 9/11. I mean, this is kind of an important chunk of time, the last 15 years.
So I think we've seen journalists, well, first of all, we started to become the target in terms of, you know, you're covering a war in Iraq or Afghanistan, or you're covering, you know, Al-Qaeda elements in Pakistan, or the Taliban, and journalists became a target suddenly. In previous conflicts, there had been a kind of acceptance of the fact that journalists were neutral. They were non-combatants. And I remember one ISIS fighter telling me, "You are a crusader of the pen." And that, I think, was a real paradigm shift, right? So journalists were no longer on the sidelines telling stories. Journalists were actively targeted. And we've seen that. We saw it in Pakistan with Daniel Pearl. We saw it in Iraq, and we certainly saw it many times over, unfortunately, in hideous fashion in Syria. So I think that was the first big shift that we saw. And then what became more disturbing and more recent, as I was going in and out of Syria, and with all the risks that that entailed, knowing that so many friends of mine had been kidnapped and some of them had even been executed, there was also this surreal moment of coming back to the US. And Jeff Zucker, the head of CNN, had asked me if I would fill in on the morning show for a couple of weeks while Alison Camerata was on vacation. And I said, of course, yeah, what a great opportunity. And after a week of doing it, I said, you know what, Jeff, send me back to Raqqa, send me back to Syria, because it was so intense. And I hadn't been prepared for it because I wasn't living in the US. The level of hostility and vitriol being leveled your way, particularly on social media platforms like Twitter, over a seemingly benign comment that you would make that was not intended in any controversial or denigrating or pernicious way, would suddenly be twisted against you. And I found that deeply disturbing, because I was like, okay, what's happening? I've got, ISIS people trying to kidnap and execute Western journalists. I have supporters of President Bashar al-Assad who are launching a full-on campaign against me online, calling me an al-Qaeda loving whore, to quote them. And then I go back home and I have a bunch of people saying all sorts of things about me based on what I thought was a pretty innocuous comment about, the dangers of being in war zones when you have a president who is consistently undermining journalists and calling us enemies of the people, and talking about fake news, etc. So there is that disturbing progression that I think we have seen. At the same time, I think that's also sort of forced journalists into a sort of defensive posture in some ways, where they feel the need to fight back a little bit and defend themselves and defend their reporting, all of which is very noble and absolutely understandable. And I'm someone who's done the same. But what it does is you do start to draw lines in the sand, right? Where you're sort of saying, this is my line in the sand. This is who I am. This is what I'm about. This is why I take umbrage at you offending or criticizing my work or being offensive or whatever it may be. And so before you know it, journalists who don't traditionally take positions are in effect being forced to take positions, because otherwise we just lie down and let the steamroller go back and forth over us. So I do think it's a slightly uncomfortable moment for journalists. Then you have, I think the goal of misinformation, and I think a lot of people don't realize this, is not to persuade you, right, that like, oh, Clarissa is an al-Qaeda lover, right? Let's use that example. No, the goal of misinformation is to spew so much nonsense out there that any normal consumer of information who does not have expertise in this is like, wow, I just don't know who to trust anymore. So I'm just going to put my hands up and say, what? That's the goal. It's not to persuade you necessarily that the gas attacks didn't take place in Ghouta at the hands of Bashar al-Assad's people and that 1,800 civilians weren't killed as a result. It's just to say, oh boy, I don't even know. Did they happen? Did they not? I'm seeing all these different things online and I can't make sense of it. And that to me is the most disturbing development that we've seen in terms of the role, the evolving role of journalists. And how do we combat that? How do we claim back the moral high ground? How do we take ownership of facts again? How do we stop these sort of pernicious campaigns that are not just designed to spread falsehoods, they're designed to create this illusion that there's no such thing as the truth. And that, honestly, is what keeps me up at night. And that is what I think the next generation of journalists are going to have to grapple with. hopefully more than the fear of kidnapping or execution.
Well, I think what you're saying is so disheartening and so real, right? Because if we muddy everything, we always could create some points of reference, right? Between what was happening in the present, what we knew about the past or didn't, what we thought might happen in the future, we could have some tent poles to construct. And even if we found that some of those tent poles weren't as honest, correct, or that they really had a kind of bias, at least we had things to compare it to that would start to disintegrate, the hierarchy. And now I think what you're saying is that we don't necessarily have those tools. So where does that leave that tug between bias and objectivity? I mean, I think there is no objectivity. I'm not saying there aren't facts, but there isn't objectivity. I remember when Sonia Sotomayor was saying, look, this is how I will come to be a Supreme Court justice from my life experience, from being an immigrant, right? And that, yes, white men were saying, oh, I have objectivity. No, you're biased. It comes through the lens that you have. So as a journalist, if you start to take hard positions, what does that mean about that tension between how you navigate bias and objectivity?
So I think the positive thing, because everything I just said before was like a little bit depressing, but the positive thing that comes with it, which also, resonates with what you're saying, is, wow, we have a broader diversity of voices telling stories. And hallelujah. Okay. That is freeing because, first of all, it punctures a myth right away in the idea of objectivity. Objectivity, as you and I discussed on Saturday, was coming home at 6:30 and 3 white men telling you what was happening, and you could choose between the 3 of them, and they're all basically telling you the same thing. And that is considered to be
right. And they assured you they'd be back the next day, that you should sleep well and rest, and they'll come back and explain it to you.
And now we have this panoply of voices with different perspectives, with different everything, different upbringings, different religions, different aspirations, different styles of storytelling, different voices, different and completely diametrically opposed different perspectives on so many different things. And that is a plus. I think we can all agree now. That is something positive. That makes the world a richer and more vibrant and interesting place. It does highlight the fact that the biases exist. And I think we all have to own up to that and accept the fact that the idea of perfect neutrality is sort of a myth, or perfect objectivity is a myth. You are who you are because of what you've experienced, and that absolutely, and how you've grown up and where you come from and what kind of education you've had, all of that translates and imprints on your work, and it's absurd to deny it. So I think that we can understand it and accept it as long as we're all on the same page that facts are facts. And Christiane Amanpour said, and it really resonated with me, she said, truthful, not neutral. Meaning, I saw what was happening in Syria, okay? And I saw that Bashar al-Assad was slaughtering his people and targeting hospitals and torturing and imprisoning and killing babies and every disgusting, inhumane, horrifying thing you could think of. And that's the truth. But I'm not neutral about it. I can't be neutral about that. I can't be like, on the one hand, this happened, but on the other hand, no. And so how do you go about resolving that? Because clearly there's a bias in my reporting, and I'm open about that in the book. Well, you have a reporter who's embedded with the regime of Bashar al-Assad as well. And he is obviously taking in everything that they have to offer and say in terms of their perspective and stance on the war. And so you have 2 different reporters coming at it from different angles. And hopefully in that sort of way, you make up for the biases that exist, whether they be biases in terms of an actual conflict and picking sides, as it were, or whether they might be more subtle biases that are a product of your upbringing and where you are. So I think as long as we can be open and honest and have a conversation about it and agree that facts are facts, and let's just like keep that as our ground line, I actually think it's a really exciting moment in storytelling.
Well, it's an incredible moment where people are realizing either again or more deeply or for the first time how central free and open and a real journalist, kind of living, breathing journalism is to the world, not just to our country, or particular countries. I love the idea of what you're saying, truthful and not neutral. And also you and I have talked about kind of honesty and authenticity. So what are the roles of journalists in kind of social impact? And what are the kinds of things that you can do, beyond kind of visibility and issues and events? But what are the kinds of things that journalism can do in terms of shifting perspectives, and as you said, not necessarily policy, that maybe other forms of communication, knowledge, reflection can't do?
I mean, for me, the sort of driving factor absolutely is to humanize. I cannot bear when I hear a conversation about Syria, and I understand these conversations need to happen. And I've been at the table with a bunch of, well-intentioned middle-aged men in Washington, D.C., opining about policy in Syria and what should be done and this and that. And I know that there's a time to be dispassionate and to have conversations purely on an intellectual level. But I often find it disturbing when no one at that table has been to Syria. No one at that table has witnessed the atrocities. No one at that table is really even being open in that moment to just feel that for a second, to open their hearts for a second, to be compassionate and to allow compassion. I don't mean to sound Pollyanna-ish here, okay? I understand that foreign policy is not based necessarily on good intentions. It's based on the national interest of nation states. But still, journalists can at least hold people accountable by saying, no, it's not just another foreign policy quandary. It's a person. She had a name. She had a child. He had a name. And the other role that I hope we can provide, and personally, this is something that I very much aspire to, is to build up a record so that when there comes a day, inshallah, where there will be Syrian generals and members of Assad's government facing trial in The Hague, there will be a record of the atrocities. There will be a record of the people who participated in those atrocities. And that is vitally important. It may not change what came before, but at least to feel that maybe you can somehow contribute to future justice on whatever small level, to me, that is profound. Okay, you haven't changed the world. Okay, you didn't solve the Syrian crisis. You didn't prevent the tremendous suffering of the people. But if any work that I did can help make sure that someone is punished for what happened or meets justice for what happened, then at least I'd sleep a little bit more easily at night.
Oh, I mean, and me too, right? And there's a long way between being gaslighted and justice, but those are bricks and those are records, and we know some of the greatest atrocities that are taking place now and have. Sometimes they are the people who are actually committing those crimes that keep such great records, and sometimes it's left to us to accompany it and to know that this isn't just going to disappear and evaporate, into kind of like, world history. So I think that is important. Those reckonings are happening here in our own country, and they're happening all over the world. And so I think that we know that archives are also disputed places of power and agency and voice. And so if we add to them, they are shifted forever. And they are not the same. Let me just ask you on a personal level, what do you have to access in yourself to do this work? To go and publicly speak at a hearing in the Senate, or to, be in the so-called field, which is really just being in the world, and then being at home and deciding to have a child, right? Or a relationship, and kind of, I'm really moved in your book about really talking in an honest way about mental health, or lack of mental health. And I know from my friendships with people who do very similar work that you have to be constantly negotiating what you let in, what you don't. I was saying on Saturday, if you become calcified, you can't do the work in the truthful, authentic way that you are known for doing and that I need you to do. If you become too porous, we'll never hear from you again, And so just in a personal level, how do you navigate that?
I mean, it's so hard. It's so hard. You are straddling worlds that are so different, and it requires some serious acrobatics to pull it off, and trying to find that balance, learning what your limits are, learning how to cope with not just the depression or irritability or insomnia or feeling of numbness or feeling of being disconnected. All of those things can come with witnessing trauma, but also the guilt, the discombobulation of being 1 minute sitting in Aleppo with bombs raining down, and someone's brother has just died, and then 2 days later I'm in the south of France drinking rosé with my best friends at the pool. How is that acceptable? How is that allowed? How do I get to just peace out when I want to or need to, and go to this beautiful place with people I care about and have a lovely time? It is incredibly difficult as a journalist, I think, if you're a sentient being, to get your head around that, and to live with the guilt, and to learn to frame it in a different way, to accept the fact that if you can't embrace your normal life, if you can't accept joy, if you don't feel worthy of it, if you have this sort of survivor's guilt that I think is very common with people who do this job, you won't be able to go the distance. At the same time, there's this other tug of war going on, which I felt very strongly in Syria, which was, okay, I'm burnt out. I am too skinny. I am feeling detached from people I love. I'm cranky. I don't want to be in London. It's gray. It's depressing. I want to be back in Syria all the time. I clearly need to take some time away from Syria to be in love with my real life again, to reconnect with it. But man, I know the more deeply I'm immersed in Syria, the more I give, the more porous I am, to use your expression, the better my work is. And so how do I navigate this with all the tremendous responsibility I feel to try to repay all these people in Syria who have risked their lives to let me tell their stories? How can I justify pulling back when I know that the work will suffer? And when the work is so good, it's so thrilling, and you want it to get better and better and better. And it becomes an addiction. I was never addicted to adrenaline. That's not the juice for me. The juice for me is the connection. And when you make those connections, you make beautiful work. And when you make beautiful work, people talk about it. It has a ripple effect. It's not about fame or anything. It's about shining that light and feeling like, yes, I nailed it. I got a lot of people to care about Syria for a day. At the same time, you know, my husband is going to leave me if I don't get my shit together. Excuse my language.
I mean, I think, you know, the idea that you talk about it as navigating as opposed to balance. I think that word balance is like, I just don't even know what, you know, what that actually means. Mother Nature isn't balanced, right? It's an ecology, which is finely tuned, but it's often out of balance and then re-navigates and kind of equalizes itself. But I think this constant navigation. So I think we'll go to some, I have more questions, but I think we'll go to some of the audience questions.
Okay.
The one thing I do want to say about what you were just talking about is that, you know, there's this in the book, the kind of guilt and shame you feel from being in a place and then going to the south of France. You know, I wish some of that guilt and shame you could share and that sense of responsibility. And nothing against the south of France. I mean, it's one of the all-time greatest places in the world, right? But, you know, that idea of how do we share that guilt and shame, right? Under our watch. These are human-made humanitarian catastrophes. These are not, we have a lot of natural disasters that are also, you know, we are also promoting them in terms of our activities, but some of the wars that you're talking about, they really are under our watch and of our making. And so where is the kind of communal guilt and shame and sense of responsibility? I want to go to a question from Allison Cuddy, who is the artistic director of the Humanize Festival. And she said that, you know, you said that the events of 9/11 really sparked your interest in covering conflict. And how has 9/11 affected conflicts across the globe almost 20 years on? And what do you think we're still reckoning with in terms of that?
It's such a good question. I mean, I meet young people today, and it blows my mind that they never lived in a pre-9/11 world. They never knew what life was like before 9/11. And I don't want to put rose-tinted glasses on and pretend like the world didn't have problems. It did, big time. But a lot of them were sort of simmering beneath the surface. And there was this sort of blithe acceptance of the world as it was, of America's role as it was, and not a huge amount of introspection maybe about how actually the world saw America and felt about America. Then 9/11 happened. You had, of course, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq. Despite whatever intentions went into those wars, it certainly didn't do anything to change the impression of people in many countries about what America's role is fundamentally in the world. And so if you think of 9/11 and the response to it as being an attempt to sort of show American power, show American strength, and show that this kind of thing could never happen again. On the one hand, it's been successful. Largely, Al-Qaeda was dismantled for the most part. Of course, it still exists, but ISIS came later. But again, they have been limited, at least geographically, in the scope of their activity. Of course, they've carried out attacks in the West, but very few in the US, and certainly nothing even vaguely approaching the scale of 9/11. But on another level, I think it's also shown the limitations of American force and American power. Look at Afghanistan. 19 years later, peace talks are happening, and the Americans are getting ready to withdraw. And I can tell you, Jane, that within a matter of months, the Taliban will be taking control again of much of that country, because the Afghan government and the Afghan army really don't have the wherewithal or the manpower or the support, frankly, outside of city centers And so you have to ask yourself, what was all that for? And why are we not any longer having a conversation about it? Because we're not talking about Afghanistan. No one's wondering why we're leaving Afghanistan. Everyone understands it's because we went with one set of intentions. We stayed for another set of intentions that were not the clearly stated objectives at the beginning. And now we're leaving with very little, frankly, to show for it, other than, some improvements to infrastructure and having obviously made some achievements with women's education and other issues. I don't mean to minimize all the work that so many people have done in Afghanistan, both military personnel and civilian American personnel as well. But you do have to ask yourself what it was all for and what was achieved and what it means in this moment. Because in this moment, I had a eureka moment earlier this year where I was like, 9/11 is no longer the thing that everything is in response to. This pandemic is now the thing that everything is in response to. And young journalists who weren't alive pre 9/11, they're not even going to be talking about 9/11 in the same way. They're going to be talking about COVID-19. And it's a different set of challenges, both domestically and internationally. And it's going to change the way we see the world yet again. And it's a dramatic departure in every way, shape, or form from that cataclysmic moment of 9/11. And yet I think we'll have the same kind of lasting effects.
I think you're right. There are these moments that define generations, the Trayvon Martin generation, the 9/11 generation, the Vietnam War generation, civil rights. But I guess what I would offer is, it's like a very tight, sauce, right? Where, I would offer that some of this making America great again comes from that idea of, over these past 20 years, where what do we have to show for the longest war, in American history, and just being part of destroying countries, the kinds of kind of groups that have come up, the kind of violence that it has shown, how is America great and how it isn't. And there is this yearning for going back to a time where we were seen as the strongest and absolutely impenetrable, right? And so even though that is baked in, and that maybe younger journalists won't understand that, but there is this idea of, can't we go back to a time where everyone thought we made peace and we came and, and I mean, like, I want to send Jimmy Carter to, witness the elections in the United States like he did, when he would go abroad, because we had this moral high ground, whether we did or didn't, right? Let me move on to another question, which is from, let's see, Kathy Edelman, who has the Kathy Edelman Gallery. I know many photographers who have been embedded in various wars, and this question always comes up. Did being a woman affect your work in any way, either positive or negative? Public never asks this question of men, and I apologize for asking, but I'm sure some of the people listening might be wondering. And Kathy, thank you, because it's one of the questions that Clarissa and I talked a lot about, and I moved from, but really talk about gender and gender lens. And also about race and class and what it means to be a woman doing this work.
So as far as I'm concerned, being a woman has been a hugely advantageous asset in doing the work that I do. And the number one reason for that is so much of my work is in very conservative Muslim countries where women and children are in a separate part of the house. And if you are a Western male or if you are a local male, you are not ever going to see or sit down or spend time with those women and children, or maybe the children, definitely not the women. And I'm talking about super conservative areas. I'm not speaking generally. So that means that I have access to 50% of the population that my male colleagues do not. And believe me when I tell you that women are a fountain of information. They tend to lie a lot less. They present things in much, sometimes more human terms. They have very different ways of expressing fear and talking about fear and owning up to fear, and very different ways of showing resilience and strength. And all of that to me is not just fascinating, it's crucially important in terms of telling these stories, in terms of giving a more nuanced and balanced look at a conflict. If you're just interviewing a bunch of male fighters, you're missing out on a big part of the story. So that's the first thing. The second thing is purely a logistical thing, which is that if I cover my hair and wear a black abaya or even a niqab, which covers everything except my eyes, no one knows that I'm a Western journalist. They're not going to look twice at me. If I'm driving through the checkpoint and it's a hostile checkpoint, I can pretend to be asleep in the back seat. Women are not seen as threatening often in countries like Syria, for example, whereas Western males are. They're usually and often seen as spies, for example, or mercenaries, or whatever it may be. So for logistical reasons as well, I've definitely found it to be an asset. There are places that I have not been allowed into, but for the most part, I was once told in Afghanistan that I was an honorary man, which I took as a compliment because it meant that I'm able to shuttle between the two worlds. I can sit in the room with the men and hear them have their conversation. And then I can go and sit with the women and hear their conversation. And they are always very different conversations, even if they're more broadly speaking about the same topic. So for me, it's hugely valuable. I can't even imagine what it would be like not to be able to really cover in a substantive way the experiences and emotions of women in war zones.
So let me ask you really quickly, what does it mean though as a white woman, right? And could you move in the same way if you were a woman of color?
That's such an important question, and it's a conversation I have so many times with my female colleagues who are from the Arab world, and they do feel that they're treated differently by all sides. Whether it might be, the local people in a certain place, whether it may be the occupying force in a certain place. And I think there is no two ways about it. As a white American woman working for a major network, you occupy a privileged space that very few other journalists have the advantage of occupying. And it's unfair. It's not right. And it's not just about being white or being American even. It's about working for a major network as opposed to being a freelancer. Freelancers face all sorts of kind of discrimination, find themselves in all sorts of dangerous situations, often from outlets that are well established and are happy to pay for something. Hey, if you get some really good shots on the front line, yeah, I'll buy your material, but I'm not going to pay for your insurance. I'm not going to send you to do a hostile environment. I'm not going to take ownership of you. I'm not going to be responsible for you. So we see this inequity on many different layers and levels in this industry.
No, I know. And more freelancers are people of color and women than are on staff and, either in print or, in broadcast. We have run out of time, I'm so sorry to say, and we have questions from all over the country, but everything you've given us has been so generous. And I just encourage everybody to read the book. It's just such a complicated and layered story. You are very generous and courageous, and also it feels like you are learning things as you're writing it, and that's an amazing gift to to experience. And I just want to thank you so much for.
Thank you so much. Really, Jane, I've enjoyed our conversation tremendously. And to all of you, I can't see you, but thank you. Thank you so much. And reach out to me anytime on social media with any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Chicago Humanities Festival. This is the kind of programming we want you to support. They are doing an incredible job at this moment, where they could have just not done anything at all. So I want to thank everybody there. And thank you so much, Clarissa. It's really an honor to talk with you.
Thank you and good night.
Good night.